Ruish, and I want to welcome you to my home. I'm so pleased you're here, and so pleased that you got here regardless of the traffic on Connecticut Avenue. So I'm delighted. About 7 or 8 years ago, I met Alexandra Hudson and Kian. I met Alexandra and Kian Hudson at an event at the Kennedy Center through some mutual friends in Washington, D.C. And we developed an immediate friendship, I think, first because she is so wonderfully gracious and interesting. But the two of them are so engaged in understanding and exploring the world around us, the political and cultural world in which we live. We stayed in touch from their move from Washington, D.C. to Indiana. And over the years, I had heard that Lexi was working on a book. And Kian, I think everyone knows you, but I don't know where. There he is. Kian. Sorry, I still mispronounce your name, and that's going to happen for years.
So you are far from the only one.
But I was delighted to be able to host an evening like this with Ashley, who I think many of you know, but oh good, there's Ashley. And just please that you can hear Lexi talk about the book and its history for yourself. So Lexi, I'm going to have you introduce Dan, and Dan's going to introduce you.
Thank you so much, Jeannie, for opening up your beautiful home to us tonight. Thanks to Ashley as well, and to all of you for being here, sharing a few minutes of your evening to talk about civility. And thanks to Dan for wanting to being up for talking about this topic. So Dan is one of my oldest friends from DC. He was at the Wall Street Journal, but most importantly, he's been at Politico for over a decade, or nearly a decade. He co-authored Playbook for several years, and he's now a White House political reporter at Politico, and he's really just Washington's reporter. Someone who never sleeps and is always on the hunt for the
You're Washington's civility expert.
Yeah, we need that. So I remember when I left government, everyone told me no one wanted this book. I was not a person, this was not the time. So it feels really rewarding, really grateful to have it be a thing and to have all of you here to celebrate and talk about it for a little bit. So thank you all for being here.
So thank you, Lexi, for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for coming out as well. So I'm going to ask her a few questions and then turn it over to you guys so you can chime in with your smart questions, and then we can go back to drinking and talking. So I guess my first question to you would be, can you tell us about the origins of the book and why you chose to write it, especially at a time of lots of divisive, toxic political environment?
I think it was the experience of the gravity of the toxicity and the division that I experienced firsthand when I was in Washington that galvanized me to write it. I've come by my interest in this topic on civility, manners, and social norms, honestly. My mother is something of an expert on this topic. She is called Judy the Manners Lady. And while I was growing up, while I was writing this book, actually, I discovered that my mother is one of 4 women who are internationally renowned experts on manners, named Judith. There are 4. Maybe it's a generational thing. The most prominent might be Judith Martin, the Washington Post columnist who goes by Miss Manners, but there are 3 others. My mom is one of them, and one thing that she excels at is reaching children with character education and music. And I am someone who is constitutionally allergic to authority.
True.
I hate being told what to do. I hate rules. That's why I was so ill-suited to government and being in a bureaucracy. But I remember my mother, growing up, she would ask us to, set the table this way and, use forks and knives. And I wanted to know why. Why do we do things the way that we do them? And why aren't we using chopsticks? or some other mechanism, receptacle to deliver food into our mouth. And she promised that following these rules of propriety would serve me well in work and school and life, and she was right. until I got to the United States Department of Education. I was there 2017 to 2018, a notoriously divided time in our nation's history, and I had everything that I knew to be good and true about the world, about myself, about how to get along with others across deep difference questioned during that season of my life and that tenure in government. And I was surrounded by these two extremes. On one hand, there were people with sharp elbows, people who were willing to bully anyone to get what they wanted and to get ahead. And on the other hand, there were people who were polished and poised and polite. And at first I thought, these are my people. And yet that I quickly realized these are the ones who would smile and flatter at me one moment and stab me in the back the next. And that really threw me for a loop, because one thing my mother had said growing up was that manners mattered because they were an outward expression of our inward character. And here I was surrounded by people who were polished and well-mannered, but ruthless and cruel. And I realized several things from that experience. One was that both of these extremes, they seem like polar opposites, but they actually are very similar. Both reflect disordered loves, a disordered soul, a soul where people are willing to instrumentalize others as opposed to seeing them as beings with dignity and equal moral worth to us and worthy of a bare minimum of respect just by virtue of our shared moral status as members of the human community. The hostile contingent sees others as worth bullying and to get ahead and get what they want. And the manipulative contingent sees others as pawns to be manipulated and circumvented in order to get what they want. So they're actually very similar. They seem like polar opposites. They're actually very similar. And I also realized from this experience that there's an essential distinction between civility and politeness, which is a core argument of the book, The Soul of Civility, that politeness is manners, it's external, it's etiquette, it's behavior, it's technique, whereas civility is internal, it's a disposition of the heart, it's a way of seeing others as our moral equals, and treating them with a bare minimum of respect just by virtue of our shared moral status as members of the human community, and that crucially, actually respecting someone sometimes means being impolite, telling a hard truth, engaging in robust debate. So what caused me to write this book, I could not write it. Again, I faced a lot of adversity, and I left government and thought deeply, what is personhood? What does it mean to be a human being? What is the bare minimum of respect that we are owed to others by virtue of our shared humanity and dignity as human beings? And what does that look like in practice, even in our very divided time? And that's kind of the premise and the moral foundation of this book.
So how have we come to this point of America being a pretty uncivil place? Because America's always, had issues in terms of people come here to this country and they were the rebels from Europe and Asia, and anyone who's an immigrant, they are choosing to leave a place to come to the US, and so they're thinking more about themselves than about their home country. And even their descendants probably have that as well. And so, but do you think it's social media? Is it the internet? Is it, how Washington doesn't work anymore because of redistricting and campaign finance? Billions of dollars spent on TV ads, or why does America feel like we're in a pretty tense spot to be, to have civility? Kind of, no one really teaches that in school.
There's no question that our moment feels really divided. There's a reason I wrote this book right now. We hear a lot of really thoughtful members of the commentariat tell us that we're uniquely rude and divided and isolated as a country right now. And yet what I learned while writing this book is that this question of civility, this question of how might we overcome our differences and peacefully coexist, this is a timeless problem. This is not a now problem, not an America problem, not a problem of modernity. That every era, in fact, tends to feel like they're in the most divided, the most fractured era. And that this question, how do we do life together across deep differences, is the defining question of democracy, of the classical liberal project, but it's also the defining human question as well. How do we overcome our differences and thrive together and peacefully coexist? As human beings, there's this duality to our nature. We're profoundly social as a species. We become fully human and we thrive in relationship with others, and yet morally and biologically, we're driven to meet our own needs before others. And these two facets of ourselves are intention, the self-love and the social. And that is why this is a timeless problem. Epiphenomena, like you mentioned, particularly on civil political leaders, social media, new technologies that destabilize, that those can exacerbate the challenge, but the challenge is timeless, and it starts and ends with us. It's never going away. I think it's helpful to remember that it's a timeless human problem, because it's easy to want to point fingers at one technology or one political figure, but it's essential, I think, to realize that there's not one cause other than the duality in our nature.
Do you think it's getting worse though, or is it, or am I misperceiving the lack of civility, or am I thinking more about civility in our political discourse, but actually in people's day-to-day interactions, especially if they live in small towns or suburbs, it's not like people are fighting their neighbors. Do you think it's like a nationwide trend where people are less civil in all facets of life, or is it mostly just in our political sphere, and it kind of migrates to how people just feel about the overall country?
It's a great question. So when I came home from work one day when I was in government, and said to my husband, I'm done with Washington, I'm done with government, let's move to Indiana, and where he's from originally. And we had talked about moving there one day. And he said, okay, done, no take backs. And a few months later, we were there. And that was 5 years ago. And one of my first friends that I made while being in Indiana her name was Joanna Taft. And she came up to me after church one day and she said, hi, I'm Joanna. Would you like to porch with us sometime? And I had never heard the word porch used as a verb before, but curious. Kana and I went to her home that afternoon, her front porch, and we realized that Joanna is staging this subversive, quiet revolution, this porching revolution from her front porch against our atomized and divided status quo. She has, to your question about whether it's really all as divided as we think, I think that there are many reasons to be concerned about our division. Again, there's a reason I wrote this book now. But the undertold story is that people are doing something about it. Joanna, for example, she's frustrated with the division in our world today, and yet she's relocating her locus of control with herself. She's saying, I can't control who's in the White House and what the scandal du jour is, and who's saying what about whom, but I can control myself, and I can make my community better and stronger. And what was radical about her porch that day is that she had curated people across politics, across race, across class, across geography. I mean, that's to your point about what's different now. It's really easy today, on one hand this is a timeless human problem, but it's really, another thing that's different though is that it's really easy today for us not to encounter people we don't want to encounter or who we differ from if we don't want to. That's both virtually but also physically. It's easy to go from the office, or home, to our cars, or to the metro, to our offices and back again, and really just curate our existences around our preferences and who we want to expose ourselves to. And there was this lovely essay written by a gentleman named Richard H. Thomas in a now defunct outlet called The Palimpsest, and he said in this essay, it was called From Front Porch to Patio. He said, 100 years ago, people sat on their front porches and they just, shot the time together and waved to their neighbors and strangers alike. And that was a social statement of communitarianism, of being present and rooted in your community. And he said, over the last century, American architecture has changed. That the front porch moved around to the side of the home and became the modern day patio that was fenced in and curated. You're not, waving to strangers and neighbors alike, like you're having people only that you want to share space with, and that you're surrounding yourself with. And so Joanna is reclaiming the front porch and the social statement that it embodies. Jane Jacobs talked about this. She called it eyes on the street, just having a presence in your community and being other oriented and focused. And so Richard H. Thomas says that this architectural shift from communitarianism, or from porching to patio, tracks a cultural shift from communitarianism to individualism. And that's what's so revolutionary and subversive about what Joanna is doing today, that she is reclaiming her front porch and staging a social and cultural revolution of community in these divided days.
So besides front porching, what are some other ways that people in this room can become more civil and tell their friends besides buying your book and reading it?
Exactly.
Is there other, I guess we should all make sure we have front porches, but is there other ways to become, to kind of live those values, especially for the next generation?
Yes, absolutely buy the book. That's really good. Support Politics and Prose, and thanks so much to Politics and Prose for being here. Support a local bookstore, a dying breed. But yes, so what I learned from Joanna is that it's not even about the front porch. The porch is just a metaphor for a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle of civility. Of living your life in a way that my mom raised us, my brothers and I, and how Joanna is living her life, of walking through life, transforming the stranger to the friend, the outsider, the insider, seeing opportunities for connection and community, creating places where people can feel seen and known and loved wherever you are. You don't need a porch to do that. I was a Novak journalism fellow, and I reported on this phenomenon across the country. People, some of them had front porches, some of them held court at a coffee shop, some of them used a French stoop or a front lawn, or a pub. Just a communal place where people can create a niche and a community that they realize they can't control what's happening around them, but they are going to embody these values and be part of the solution in how they live their lives.
When do you think civility is not required? So there's part of the book where you say it's actually, you should kind of not listen to my advice on the civility aspect, or at least be uncivil in a civil fashion. Can you touch on that, please?
Right, so I reclaim the whole tradition of civil disobedience in my conception of civility. The etymologies throughout my book, I love the history and origin of words and then the stories behind our language. And so the etymology of these two words, civility and politeness, supports this distinction that I make in the book. The etymology of politeness is poliere, which means to smooth or to polish. So it's a good visual for what politeness does. It papers over difference. It's superficial, it polishes over difference, as opposed to giving us the tools to grapple with difference head on. The Latin root for civility is civitas, which is all things related to citizen, city, and citizenship, and that is what civility is. It's the duties and the habits of a citizen in the city that, again, sometimes requires robust debate, truth-telling, and especially in democracy, it requires protest. Our country was founded on protest and revolution, and there's a rich and vibrant tradition of protest and civil disobedience in our nation. And so I borrow from Thoreau, Gandhi, and Dr. King to. I really focus on Dr. King, for example. His, he was protesting racial injustice in our country, segregation. Anyone who wanted to be part of his peaceful, nonviolent resistance movement had to undergo a process called purification, and that was literally purifying their motives and cultivating the disposition of civility, cultivating love and affection and respect for the bigoted white supremacists who were supporting segregation. And so first they had to cultivate a love and respect for their fellow human beings, fellow citizens, and that demanded that they protest. That informed the sit-ins, that informed the marches, that informed the letter-writing campaigns, that civility demands action sometimes, but it also takes certain action off the table. For example, with Dr. King's peaceful nonviolent resistance movement, violence was never an option. Destroying property or degrading the personhood of another human being through violence towards them, that was never an option. So civility in its truest sense, the duties befitting and the conduct befitting a citizen in the city, both demands action sometimes, including protest, and it also takes certain action off the table categorically.
So when we're uncivil to others, you write that it hurts ourselves too. Can you kind of expand on that and tell us how it does that?
I think Jim's here. Is he from Aspen? There he is. Yeah. So when I was in government, I was invited to a retreat, courtesy of the Aspen Institute, and we went to beautiful Wye River, and I was with select other political appointees, congressional staffers across the political spectrum, and a few others, and we were talking about civility in modern American life. That was our topic at hand. And it provided this amazing opportunity to closely reread Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail. And Dr. King in his letter, he says that segregation is harmful because it hurts both parties. It hurts the segregated by giving them a false sense of inferiority. And it hurts the segregator by giving them a false sense of superiority. It deforms their soul. And this is actually where the title of my book, The Soul of Civility, comes from. I borrow that argument against segregation, that it's mutually harmful, and apply it to civility. That and Dr. King was getting this from Socrates. Socrates said that virtue was its own reward because virtue was health of the soul. A healthy soul, treating others with grace and compassion, that was its own reward. A vicious soul, a soul that was malicious and unkind to others, that was symptomatic of an unhealthy soul, and that was its own punishment. That people who are cruel and vicious and malicious, they don't deserve our disdain. They deserve our compassion because they're sick, whether they realize it or not, or want to acknowledge it or not, that they're deeply sick. So that's the intellectual well that Dr. King was drawing from, and I borrow that and apply it to civility. That when we debase another human being with cruelty and malice, that we don't just hurt others, we hurt ourselves too. We make ourselves a little less human. But conversely, when we are gracious and kind and hospitable to others, especially those who are not like us, who can not do anything for us in return, and those we don't like, even the hallmark of true civility, that's mutually ennobling. That both parties become not just more human, but more humane. Our humanity is literally cultivated and refined. So just as incivility is mutually harmful, civility is mutually ennobling.
So with that, we'd like to just take a couple of questions if anyone has them, and if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Mr. Carney.
I'm Tim Carney. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for trying to make it sound like a virtue to either go to the neighborhood pub or sit on your front porch. I really appreciate that. Your book has some anthropology in it, I feel like, that you haven't spoken about yet. That civility has to do with human dignity and the value of every individual. And that, I thought, was one of the great ways in which you contrasted civility with simple politeness. That politeness was on the surface, civility was deeper. Just please say more about how human dignity, the understanding of the individual, and whether there's a supernatural or religious understanding of the individual.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm open about my faith. I'm a Christian. I'm open about my politics. I lean classical liberal and conservative. I call it owning my priors. Like, I want readers to know that the approach that I take with writing this book. But all that to say, tiny footnote, every page I want to be, with an ecumenical spirit. Like, I hope people from all backgrounds, all walks of life, all political stripes can take away it and feel like affirmed and not affirmed, but encouraged and instilled with hope by it. That was definitely the aspiration of the book. But all that to say, yes, human dignity, the imago Dei is central. It's the moral foundation of this idea of my philosophy of civility as I unpack in the book. The imago Dei is this Judeo-Christian idea that all human beings, men and women, are created in God's image. We bear the imprint of the divine. And that is why we are each owed and owe to others a bare minimum of respect by virtue of our shared humanity, by virtue of that imprint of the divine that we all share, that we each have this kernel, a kernel of the divine within us by being created in God's image. And that is where, that's central to the foundation of civility, absolutely. And Dr. King was unabashed about this as well. Also in his letter, he talks about, how do we tell a just law from an unjust law? any law that degrades human dignity and human personality is unjust. If it doesn't square with the moral eternal law, that's unjust, and it should be discarded, and we should protest, and we should not follow it. Whereas any law that affirms human dignity, human personality, that's a just law, and we can follow it in good conscience. But I take that framework and apply it to just and unjust social norms. You know, when we're in a social setting, you know, we can apply that same idea that a just social norm is one that affirms and uplifts human personality and human dignity, and an unjust one is one that degrades it. I love this line from George Bernard Shaw. He says, you can get away with, I'm paraphrasing, he says that you can get away with, you know, basically anything if you can only follow the rules. You know, like that following the rules of etiquette and propriety, you can actually, you know, do a lot of harm to people. You can actually degrade human dignity, human personality by blindly following rules of etiquette and social norms, such as norms that say certain people drink out of this fountain and use that bathroom, and others use this one, or blindly following laws that codify the ideas of inequality. And that we each have a responsibility to engage our minds and think critically about our laws and our norms, and, you know, to borrow Dr. King, whether they square